scriptures. So at any rate, the last week what we kind of came to was, to recap everything, is you cannot say that spanking is wrong. You cannot say that spanking is unbiblical. You cannot say that spanking is not loving, and all these kind of things that are often said by proponents of not spanking. On the other hand, I'm not prepared to say that if someone who is a parent says, well, I don't spank, I do this or that instead, I'm not prepared to tell them that they're going to lose their soul over that, because, again, we do not have an explicit command in the New Testament to spank. I would question what wisdom they're using in that and ask them how that lines up with the wisdom God has given with regard to spanking. Are you following godly wisdom, or are you following worldly wisdom? We've talked a little bit in here about modern psychology affecting this. I'm not against modern psychology. I don't think modern psychology is bad. However, just like everything, you have to chew up the meat and spit out the bones, and there are some very large bones in modern psychology that need to be spit out. One of the strongest of which being the idea, guys, one of the people that's noted with it is Dr. Spock, who later on admitted that his teachings had led to the generation that came up that he was displeased with. This whole self-esteem in my child, and just overly focusing on the self-esteem of a child rather than correcting the child. And so we've covered all that. We've talked about all that. This morning what we want to talk about is, just for a few minutes, the more practical side of this. And this is the question that has come up and people have asked, which is, if I spank my children, will I get reported to DFACS, is what we call it in Georgia, Child Protective Services? Well, am I going to get reported if I spank my child, is a question that often comes up. And our initial answer is, maybe. Like, the fact of the matter is, you could not spank your child and get reported to DFACS. In fact, when I was reading about DFACS reports, I noticed that one of the things that kept popping up is that they are overrun with unnecessary reports. And some of those reports are vindictive reports. In other words, some of those reports are maybe a boyfriend and girlfriend have a child and they break up, and then the boyfriend wants the child and he calls on the woman, or just to make her life miserable, he calls on the woman, or vice versa. Same can happen with marriages. The bottom line is, it could be, maybe it's not even that's in your child. Sometimes people will. I got a phone call from a young lady, young mother, one time, and she was upset because she'd had DFACS called on her by somebody who was angry with her. They were angry with her personally, so they called DFACS on her. And so that can happen. The bottom line is, whether you spank or not, you can get reported to DFACS, because anybody can file a report with DFACS. So, but let's notice some points about that we need to keep in mind. First of all, again, we're going off the fact that we're going to do what is biblical. And it is biblical in your home to spank your child within reason. We always want to remember that addition. Not everything that some people call spanking is spanking. You can cross a line, even with the idea of spanking. So within reason, that is a corrective action. And point number one would be, you cannot control others. We don't need to live, if the fear is, well, if I do this, I'll get reported. If I do that, just be the best parent you can be godly, and let the world and whatever do what they want. Point number two is the idea of meeting the bar. And the reason I bring this up is, when someone makes a report to DFACS, and in particular, that I know of, there's two kinds of reports. There might be more, but that I know of, there's two kinds of reports to DFACS. Well, maybe three. But you can call in DFACS and you can make an anonymous report, which a lot of the false reports are anonymous. The second thing you can do is you can call into DFACS and you can give them your name and your information to make a report. The third thing you can do is, if you're a mandated reporter, and there are several mandated reporters in this room. I am one of them. Really, technically in the Lord's church, I shouldn't necessarily be a mandated reporter, but they think I'm a pastor, right? They say clergy. They think I'm a pastor. Really, our elders more appropriately would be the mandated reporters. But I understand why they would. Look, the state views me as a mandated reporter. So that's the third kind. A mandated reporter, you don't get to be anonymous. You have to tell them who you are, and you don't get to choose whether or not you report under certain circumstances. If you see something happen that is clearly and plainly child abuse, you must report it. If you don't report it, it's a misdemeanor in the state of Georgia. If you don't report it and the child is hospitalized or killed, that can be upgraded to a felony for not reporting. So, and that's the case for mandated. If you're a mandated reporter, you probably know this. Although I was a mandated reporter for years and had no clue any of this. I didn't understand it at all. And so if you work in a field where you consistently engage children or their parents, you probably ought to look into that and see if you're a mandated reporter, and there's online training for that. But when you call in, especially if you're anonymous, even if a mandated reporter calls in or goes to the mandated reporter portal to report and just say, I'm scared I'm going to get reported. Okay, you're out with your child, you discipline them, and somebody calls and reports you. When they report you, what the person who receives the report from DFACS, it's not a local person, it's a national thing. And when they get that report, they make a decision. Does this meet the bar for child abuse? And so if you call and said, which is what happened to this young lady who called me, she never got in any kind of issue with it because it was she was just told, I'm reporting you. But it never came across her legally because it was a silly report. She just spanked her child, and someone didn't like it and said, I'm going to report you. Well, DFACS gets called from people who do horrible, horrible things. If you call and say, oh man, she swatted her child on the rear end, that is not going to meet the bar. The report has to meet the bar where that person who receives it, and obviously this is subjective to some degree, that person has to determine this is worthy of our time and resources that are already stretched very thin because there are people doing terrible things to children out there. And so it's got to meet the bar. And so if you swatted your child on the rear end in Walmart for whatever, and someone saw you and they called DFACS and said, somehow they got your information, they got your license plate or something, and they said, this person spanked their child. Look, I don't work for DFACS. I'm just telling you, it's not going to pass. The cops aren't going to show up to arrest you. You smack your child in the face and someone calls DFACS. I know someone personally who spent a night in jail for smacking their child in the face. So I guess that would be the answer is, what are you doing in front of people? I think that'd be the big question. What are you doing? What are you doing behind closed doors? What are you doing? If you're spanking your child and you're being biblical about it, I would not worry about that. Number 3, DFACS is not the police. And that's another important thing to remember. In other words, what if somebody reports me to DFACS? Well, if DFACS shows up to your house, that's not a police officer showing up to your house. They're not showing up to your house with guns and kicking your door in. They're going to knock. They're going to ask permission to speak with you. They would ask permission to speak with your child to come into your home. You can accept that or you can refuse that. If you're respectful and calm, either way will be fine. Because some people do. They say, I'm just not going to talk to you. I'd like a lawyer present, or no, I don't feel comfortable talking to you. You're respectful and calm, that'll be fine. They are looking for signs. When they're investigators, when they come, they're looking for signs that you are an abuser or abuse is occurring in your home. If you show them those signs, they're going to ratchet that up. So in other words, again, if you are a reasonable Christian person, behaving in a reasonable Christian manner, this is almost certainly not going to become an issue for you, particularly in the state of Georgia, and particularly because to spank your children in a reasonable way is, not only is it a biblical concept that you have the right from God to do, it is a legal idea in the state of Georgia. It is absolutely legal in the state of Georgia to spank your child within reason for corrective purposes. It is not legal in the state of Georgia to smack your child across the head or in the face. It is not legal in the state of Georgia to grab any object you want and start hitting on your child. But to, in a controlled manner, spank your child on their backside for misbehavior is protected by law in the state of Georgia. And so, again, somebody calls DFACS on you and that's what you've done? I'll tell you like one brother said, I heard one brother say, hey, if you hadn't abused your child, you're going to be fine. Right? If you have abused your child, well, it's time to repent. You need the forgiveness of God, and you need some serious help to prayerfully become the parent you need to be rather than the parent you're being. The question is, what's the DFACS process like? Again, if you want, I'm not an expert on this, and I'm really not trying to go into deep detail on this. I'm going to give you the general. I called a friend who worked in social work for a while. He does this for a living not from the DFACS side, from a licensed therapist side. And what he does is he's in homes where children are beaten horribly. He's in homes where children are locked in rooms and left there. He's in homes where children are cussed at and kicked by their parents. He's in homes where children are emaciated from lack of nourishment. So he sees the darkest sides, and he sees all the different spectrum of it. But I just called him and talked to him about what a DFACS report is like. Fill me in. So again, this is not from DFACS. If you want more information on this, call DFACS, call a lawyer, whatever. You can get more information online or by phone. First of all, you get a visit. So DFACS will send a couple people out, and like we said before, they're just investigators. They're really there looking for any kind of clue that there needs to be more investigation, or if everything's okay. At that point, they'll request interviews. They'll want to talk to the parents. They'll want to talk to the children. Then they'll start to make decisions, and those decisions are varied. In other words, DFACS can give you a suggested family plan that would include whatever suggestions they have for you. These things are not enforceable by law. Or they might make this decision. They might see you or your home or your children, and they might say, this is not good. And if they see the way you behave, your spouse behaves, or your children behave, or the way your home, something about the property that indicates to them that abuse is occurring, then they're going to kick it up to the legal side. And that is when the law will get involved. So once again, we are Christians. We ought to be the best people. Say that right now today, someone called DFACS on Nancy and me. And so tomorrow, the next day, whatever, they usually respond pretty quickly. I believe it's 48 hours. Is that right, 48 hours? Huh? 24 to 48 hours. So they be at our house Monday or Tuesday. If DFACS comes to our door, we're Christians. And you know what? I mean, and you can disagree with this, and that's perfectly fine. You could say, I'll just go get a lawyer. That's perfectly fine. That's your business. But I would just say, okay, what's going on? And they'd say, well, we have a report. I say, okay, well, come on in. Excuse us that the house isn't perfectly picked up. Sorry, Nancy, I didn't mean to tell on you. No, we have 4 little children, right? House isn't perfectly picked up, but come on in, have a seat, whatever. We want to talk with you. Ask whatever questions you want. We'd like to talk with your children. Perfectly fine. You can have a conversation with any of our children. Now, they do have an age limit on what age child they'll talk to alone. But yeah, you can talk, particularly, obviously, they can talk to Ava, and they're going to ask her those kind of questions. Do you get fed? Do they hit you? How do they hit you? How many times? Things like that. They're going to ask them those kind of questions. They're not looking for anything except to find out, is abuse occurring in the home? That's their only job. That's not to say DFACS employees are perfect or DFACS policies are perfect. Not claiming that. But their overall directive is to stop or prevent abuse. And so that's going to happen. And so we would have them in, we'd have those conversations, and they would leave. And they'd still make their decision. And they might go legal or they might not. But I'm going to tell you something. If you have them into your home and you talk to them, and you're not abusing your children, they're just going to go on about their business. And you know why? Because sadly, there are plenty of people that abuse children. There are plenty of children who need DFACS because they are hopelessly, helplessly stuck in a state of abuse. And so there's no value in saying, well, man, that nice couple whose kids said that they treat them well, but they spank them sometimes when they're bad, man, let's spend all our resources that we don't have to go after them. It's just unreasonable. And so that's what the DFACS process is like. And it is true, they end up making the decisions, but even when they make their decision is a recommendation. They don't actually make the real decision. The real decision comes from a judge. They pass up their report to a judge, and then that judge says, yeah, we need to address these people from the legal. And that's when the police get involved, and that's when the law gets involved, and that's when you need a lawyer, and that's when all that stuff happens, is if a judge looks at what was said or done and says, yes, this is alarming, this is concerning, we need to address this. And so, again, if what you did, what does a judge look at? Does a judge, and Dorinda will know this very well, is a judge terribly concerned with the DFACS handbook, or is a judge terribly concerned with the laws of the state of Georgia? Yeah. And so if the report is you spanked your child reasonably, that is, you spanked your child, but they talked to you or they talked to the kid, and you didn't smack them across the head, you didn't hit them with some crazy object, you didn't hold them down and whip them till they were beaten half to death, you just spanked your child. What is a judge going to say? Is a judge going to put a bench warrant out for you? Is a judge going to send them out for further this, that, and is the judge going to do any of that? No. He's going to say, well, they followed Georgia state law. Judges are human. Obviously, a judge could make a mistake. We're talking about in a generality. Yes, ma'am.
All of them, but definitely the juvenile court judge are sworn to do what is in the best interest of the child.
Judges are sworn to do what's in the best interest. If you don't know, Dorinda served in give me the specific.
Court reporter and caseworker in the juvenile court of Columbus, Wisconsin.
Court reporter, caseworker.
Court operator. I was a mandated reporter.
Mandated reporter.
By virtue of the fact that I know the law.
But you worked in the juvenile court for the judges that handle these exact cases. You've witnessed these cases take place many, many, many times. Dorinda has also been helping me, by the way. The reason I have this book is Dorinda gave it to me to read. The reason I have these notes are from Dorinda. Dorinda's been helping me with this side of this and understanding some of this. So there you have it. Obviously, Dorinda's probably the most knowledgeable person about this side of this that's in here for obvious reasons. None of the rest of us have ever done this or seen this on a professional level on a day-to-day basis. And like you said, the judge is sworn to do what's best in the best interest of the child. And I happen to have someone that I'm close to who did hit their child in the mouth, popped their child in the mouth, and got to spend the night in jail. And he admitted, he said, yes, I hit my child in the mouth. Small child, popped, she smarted off and he popped her. I'm going to tell you something, that's not good. I know some of y'all are old school, I'm just telling you, it's not good. And it's certainly not good. Let's pause right here. We're Christians. And Paul told the Romans I believe it's Romans 14, to obey the government, to obey those that have authority over you. Now, we also know that we ought to obey God rather than men. But if within the confines of what is legal, we can do what is biblical, why would we step outside of that? Can you perform corporal discipline, spank your child in the way the Bible instructs? Yes. Can you do it in the state of Georgia without breaking the law? Yes. Then why would you do it in a way that is not written in the Bible that would break the law of Georgia? That doesn't make sense as a Christian. I can go ahead and tell you, everybody I've ever known whose parents struck them in the face, and I haven't talked to a whole lot of really old people about this, but people my age have resentment from that. No one likes being hit in the face. And this man regretted having done that. He lost his temper, she was smarting off, and he popped her on her mouth. Unfortunately, he was wearing a rather large ring, and it left a mark here on her lip. And then her teacher asked her, oh, what happened to your lip? My daddy hit me. Well, where do you think that went? That man, who's a good man, he's a good man, he's a good father. But a detective showed up to his office and said, did you hit your daughter in the face? And he said, I did. They didn't cuff him, but they said, come with us. And he had to go down and have an interview, and he had to, they didn't put him in jail cell. He sat in a room all night, and he went home, and they just said, hey, don't do that again, or we'll remove you or the child from the home. Don't hit your kid in the face. As a Christian, could you accept that response? I could. If someone from the state told me, you hit your kid in the face, don't you do that again? I mean, I'd be ashamed I'd hit my kid in the face. And he was ashamed. And he's a good father, and that never happened again, and his kids grew up and left the home happy and all that. And so I guess that's the overall answer to that. And that leads us to is there anything else, Dorinda, can you think of anything else on the DFAC side of things that we need to discuss?
They have as procedures, they are an investigative arm of the law, is what the law reads. They go in to investigate, like you said, they're looking for marks, they're looking for indicators, all this kind of thing. And then they do the report and take it back to the judge. The judge then makes the decision of what's best interest of the child. For instance, he's not going to put them with a family member until he finds out exactly what's going on in that home, because the family member has access, or the mother or father would have access to the child with a family member. Yeah, there was a judge, one of my dear friends that was in Atlanta. He was Atlanta Fulton County juvenile court judge, and he made the news, investigative news with Josh Mankiewicz years ago. He got in a big argument with him because there was a report in Atlanta, Fulton County, of a sect. It was a religious sect. And one child was found to have been abused and had marks on it. Well, there were 28 other children in that house. It was called House of Prayer. And the judge went in. He had the police go in, take all of those children out. He says, I need to find out what's going on. He says, because my job is to do what's in the best interest of that child and these children, and I am not going to let them be hurt. And so he pulled them out, and that made the news, and he ended up on TV and got a big squabble with Josh Mankiewicz over it. But he was adamant. He said, my job is to do what's in the best interest of that child or these children. I got to know what's going on there.
Yeah, ultimately, our government is supposed to be doing, in this area, they're supposed to be doing things to protect and help children. That can get broken because, look, they're not Christians and they're not held to the high standard of the Lord. And so, obviously, the best answer in all this is be a Christian. I do know you mentioned they're looking for marks, they're looking for this. They're also looking for the demeanor and stability of the parents and things of that nature. Any of those triggers are going to cause that to go further. So again, be a Christian, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, be a Christian, and you're going to make it through okay. If you're being unchristian-like, either to your child or to the people that visit you, then yes, you may end up in some trouble. Now, here's the last question we had. What are we going to do if the U.S. bans spanking? We asked this because in Europe, they're already doing this, okay? There are certain countries in Europe that have already, it is illegal to spank. What are we going to do as Christians if they ban spanking? Well, let's look at this. It was Romans 13. I got it a little bit wrong. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. Obviously, this doesn't supersede. I mean, if our government tells us you can't worship God, what are we going to do? We're going to worship God. But as much as I possibly can as a Christian, I'm supposed to be following the laws of the land. A Christian ought to be, and I've heard older preachers say this quite a bit. If you're a Christian, you ought to be the best employee that your employer has. If you're a Christian, you ought to be the best citizen that your government has from the civic standpoint. We might agitate them by preaching the gospel if they don't like the gospel, but from a civic standpoint, you ought to be a model citizen. A police officer should not have to be nervous about you if you're a Christian. If you're a Christian, you ought to be the best husband or the best wife. In other words, we are called to a higher calling. We don't answer to men. We answer to God. And so when he tells us to obey the government, we ought to do that. Now, the flip side of that comes from Acts 5:29, of course, a famous passage. What? But Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. If the government comes out and says spanking is illegal, that would not supersede the Word of God. But it would make me rethink how I'm going to go about some of those things. I've already told you, as far as Nancy and I go, we don't spank our children in front of people. First of all, I think it's just embarrassing to the child, so we don't do it. But the main reason we don't do it is because we're aware that there are people who will report you for spanking your kid. I think some years ago, the rumor got started that it was actually illegal. It kind of got spread pretty widely that it was illegal to spank your kid in the state of Georgia. It wasn't true, but it got started. And there are people who still believe that and still think that. and still behave that way. I'm a supporter of spanking. We do spank our children. I'm saying this, I guess this kind of breaks my rule. I'm saying this on a live stream that's on the internet. But we don't do it in front of people. And we don't do it when we're out of our minds. It's always controlled. It's always with a purpose. It's always done carefully. It's always done without some strange foreign object that people like to want. If you're grabbing an object and hitting your kid, that's child abuse. Sorry. If you're reaching over and smacking your kid across the head because they've annoyed you, that's abusive. You would hate to live in that environment. We all live with punishment. I mean, as a preacher, I live with punishment. I can get called into an elder's office and get told what's going on as an adult. But I sure enough wouldn't want an elder swatting at me all the time. I mean, even verbally. You see what I'm saying? If your kid is hand shy, there's a serious problem in your home. We would feel terrible if a dog is hand shy. We say, man, that dog is abused. He's hand shy. Have you seen children that are hand shy? I have. Have you seen children that when mama or daddy gets a look on their face, they shy away from them? I have. That's a problem. But if you're spanking your kids, which is what this class got started on, because there's several that had questions about spanking and is it okay? Is it biblical? Is it not biblical? Am I going to go to jail for it? If you're spanking your kids in the ways we've described from the scriptures, hey, whether or not the state has your back, the Lord does. And frankly, because you live in the state of Georgia, the state's got your back. And so that is my conclusion of the material I've got to cover that. I hope that I have answered the questions that people had. If I have not fully answered your question, you can come sit down and talk with me. Better yet, if you're a parent and you're concerned with this or struggling with this, sit down and talk with the elders. They've reared up children. They have helped others with child problems. So you can sit down and talk with them, and they can certainly help instruct you or answer any questions. At this time, are there any questions or comments regarding this subject? All right. Good. Okay, so that is going to conclude our study of this particular subject. And we got, how much time we got, Barry? I see 30 minutes, right? 5 minutes? How much time we got for real? It's 15, right? No, I've got my next subject. Well, go ahead. No. Go ahead, Mitch. Mitch, help me out. What you got? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, we have to guide them. And I think the point you made is something that most parents, I know I can. So what Mitch was talking about was with Eli, he feels like he was a little too strong with him early on. And he said, but then he still went on and he still spanks him and everything, but he softened some. And I think that that's probably typical of most. I know it strikes with me. and not just spank, like just in general, we were much stricter on Ava in the very early years. And then we're like, this isn't really necessary for us to be this strict. And poor Ava, though, now Ava was, Ava was one of the most intense small children that I have known. But yeah, we certainly changed our parenting. And I'll be honest with you, I think most parents do by naturally anyway over years. But we realigned exactly how we were going to approach punishment. Yes, ma'am. Okay. You know I'm nervous if my wife speaks up while we're closing out the subject. Yeah, we talked about that a little bit in class, how spanking is meant to be corrective. It's not, if you're spanking your kid to take out your emotions on them, if you're spanking your kid to scare them, if you're spanking your kid because, well, they did this and now they're going to, like that is not the biblical purpose of spanking. The biblical purpose of spanking is it is a part of discipline. It's only a part of discipline. You also have, yes, you have to explain and help them understand, but don't say that thing about this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you, because any of you who got that said to you, you never believed your parent.
Always said the same thing.
Yeah. It's true, but you don't believe in your kid.
There were 5 of us. No, not that. But
Go ahead.
Yeah, there were 5 of us, and she always said that I got more spankings
than
my younger brother did, and everybody in between, because she said you don't leave the hospital with a book, an owner's manual, or a book of how to do things. You have to learn as you go along. So they learned as they went along. And my sister-in-law said that she was going to talk to hers until she said, I found myself trying to reason with a 2-year-old. And I said, no, we'll do the talking later, the reasoning later. But right now, we're going to have to go back this way. So
I think that's a general rule. It didn't work in my household, but I think that I was the baby by far, and I got all of the spankings. So I was the only boy, but I got all of the spankings. So it's a general rule. It's not always true. And that didn't soften up later. Like, pretty steady. But yeah, so I'm with you on that. Yes, sir.
So I think also, which you talked about, but you need, every child is different. You even having 4 girls, they're all going to be a little bit different, and they all probably are going to take correction differently. And I think sometimes fathers need to understand too, with their daughters as they get older, and all the time this one that they give them, say, a teenage daughter, more likely you're not going to take them over the knees and spank them in privacy. But that's just common sense things that sometimes it needs to be verbalized.
Yeah, Barry pointed out that, because he was pointing out, we got 4 girls, and he was saying, they're all different. And as a father, you have to take that into account. Whether they're girls or boys, you have to take into account that your children are different, and how you're going to approach that. And Barry also pointed out, you're probably not going to take your teenage daughter over your knee and spank her. Exactly. And so, that's now. Look, I don't have a boy, but I can remember one time when I was in high school, and I was taller than my father, and he didn't exactly put me over his knee, but he made me understand. When I was offensive, strongly offensive to my mother. I mean, like, in a way I should never have done. And my father helped me to understand that I was never to address his wife that way. But yeah, and it is different, child to child, situation to situation. And so you don't want to paint with too broad a brush. Look, when Ava was 2 or 3, and I said, young lady, you get in your room, that's inappropriate, she would have looked at me defiantly and told me right what I could do. If I even cut my eyes at Nora, to this day, she'll just break down crying. That's two very different children with two very different disciplinary needs. Yeah, that's a good point, Barry. Nancy, oh, good grief. Turn my mic off. What does that mean? Yeah. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So Nancy's point was be an advocate for children who need it. Because regardless of the situation, they need it. And you said they will appreciate it. I don't know if that child will appreciate it or not. I don't know if that child will ever come to the knowledge that you were their advocate or that they needed an advocate. Frankly, if a child's going to hate you forever for being their advocate, be their advocate. Be the person that stands the line between children and abuse in any situation where that's where you're placed. Don't be a vigilante. Don't decide for yourself what abuse is. If you know abuse is occurring, it is just incredibly ingrained in a Christian behavior that you would protect the weak. And there's no one more vulnerable than a child. And when you look at the kind of young people that need extensive therapy when they're older, it always ties back to abuse, and almost always abuse where responsible adults they should have been able to trust, who could have delivered them, did not. I spent a couple hours on the phone 2 weeks ago with a young lady whose father abused her, and her mother stood by and did nothing. Guess who she has extreme resentment toward? Yeah, both of them, right? You cannot turn a blind eye to abuse, or you are aiding and abetting in that abuse. And I'm not talking about legally. I don't know all the legal stuff there for every situation. I'm talking about as a Christian. And so that's a very good point. And by the way, we're not talking about, I personally know of many situations where a child is sexually abused and responsible adults in their lives knew about it, but it would cause too much of a hubbub or too much trouble to address it. So what they do is they say, well, we'll try to keep you from being around that person. Don't leave a child in that kind of situation. That's a very good point. That's a very good point. Again, at the end of the day, we're Christians. Yes, sir.
Also always felt, and I told my children, as a parent, it was my job to prepare them to be able to survive in society and also to be a good, faithful Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people need to realize that as parents, that is our responsibility to furnish them with that teaching. A lot of that correction is so that they understand authority, they understand their place and how to deal with authority. And we start at a young age and are consistent with that, then they understand. And the younger you start, the better you are. And of course, ultimately we want to, our Father disciplines us, and we have to understand, even as adults, we still need His correction and discipline when we read His Word, and it hits us the way that we need it.
And I do too, and I think the older they get, and they can understand, because you made a decision, even you as a child, of course, you don't have to put it on their level.
Yeah.
Every decision I make or you make has consequences.
Yeah.
You make a poor decision. And that's a consequence of what you chose to do. So the punishment is the consequence of the choice you made.
Yeah. No, that's excellent points. A couple of people in here with more life experience have pointed out that our job is to train them up to where they can be Christians, and they need to understand rules. They need to understand responsibility. They need to understand repercussions. Scripture's all about that. That's all throughout the Scripture. I've heard people say before, well, God doesn't punish. And I'm like, have you read your Bible? Like, what are you talking about? I won't punish because God doesn't punish. Well, you got the Cotton Patch version? What's going on here? If the apostles went to Atlanta in your Bible, you need a new Bible, okay? So I don't know what you're reading, but that's not the Bible. So that's an excellent point. Yeah, we're trying to prepare them. But hey, take the flip side of that coin. You want to guarantee your children, not guarantee, you want to make the strongest possible case that your children will not grow up to be Christians, be abusive or allow abuse to occur to them and do nothing about it. You know what that's going to, you know what that's going to do to that baby? And no, it don't matter how much scripture you talk. I can be a gospel preacher. It doesn't matter how much scripture you talk. It doesn't matter how much Bible you know. It doesn't matter how many times you drag them to church services. If you're abusive or you allow abuse to occur to them, they are going to absolutely resent you and your faith. And so that's the flip side of that coin too. You've got to walk that line. It's not an easy line to walk. You've got to walk that line of being firm and a disciplinarian, but also being fair and taking care of that child's well-being. That's not an easy task, but hey, we as Christians ought to be able to walk that line. If I can't walk that line, something's either wrong with my Christianity or something's wrong up here, and I need help one way or the other. I was going to say, you see this.
I see the repercussions, and these children learn from what you're teaching them, okay? And when you use violence to correct somebody or to, if you go out in anger and hit a child, that child learns that is the way to deal with problems that they have, that they hit other people or they become abusers themselves.
Yep. They do, and I just recently had an account shared with me where at a home, and you've worked in homes some, at a home for boys, you obviously work with girls, but at a home for boys where the attendant at the home, basically the same job you have, he just does it with boys, one of the young men, I think he was 15, beat the attendant down, like beat him up, and they did not arrest him. He was not arrested for it. He didn't get in trouble for it. Now, you want to know why? You want to know why? That boy was in that home because he'd been beaten, right? And you know what that attendant did? That attendant started telling him how he was going to beat him. And guess what that boy did? He believed him. And he snapped and he beat him first. The damage you do, the damage can be done. And it's not that it can't be fixed. It's just that, buddy, if you know any of these people, whether it was sexual abuse, whether it was physical abuse, as some have pointed out to me during this class, look, deriding your child and making them feel about this big it will stick with them for the rest of their life too. Whatever type of abusive behavior you put toward your child, or you allow to be put toward they're going to live with that. And it's going to have negative repercussions. And what does the scripture say? Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. We're supposed to raise them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Now, would Jesus ever spank somebody? He did. He spanked adults, didn't he? He did. Would Jesus ever abuse somebody? He would not. All right, good. That will conclude this class. Next week, we're going to move forward to the next subject. If you have more questions, see an elder.